In every crime, there's a reflection. A motive hidden in plain sight. A truth distorted by silence. Welcome to the Forensic Mirror, where psychology meets evidence, and every case reveals more than just what happened, it reveals why. Welcome back, truth seekers. You're now tuned into the Forensic Mirror, where shadows speak and silence is never innocent. Each week, we peel back the layers of guilt, decode the psychological fingerprints, and stare straight into the eyes of calculated chaos. This isn't just true crime. It's truth, dissected. Madness, mapped. And justice, relentlessly pursued. Episode 3, The Toolbox Killers, a case that shook the system. Welcome back to the Forensic Mirror. Today I will be exploring the dark underbelly of the late 1970s in Southern California, debunking its image as a haven of innocence and freedom by highlighting the surge in violent crime and the emergence of notorious serial killers, Lawrance Bittaker and Norris, the Toolbox Killers. It details how their horrific partnership grew from personal trauma, psychological pathology, and systemic failures, ultimately embodying the era's collapse of perceived safety and innocence. I will be providing backgrounds for both men, illustrating how a combination of manipulation, emotional damage, and societal neglect contributed to their infamy. Stay tuned while we get started.
So, it started in the late 1970s in Southern California, which was often seen as a romantic place, a period of sun-drenched innocence and cultural freedom. It was a time when young people would hitchhike without a second thought, and the notion of community trust was a tangible part of daily life. This perception of a carefree society was, however, a fragile facade already beginning to crack under the weight of a far more sinister reality. The region was not, in fact, an oasis of safety, but a breeding ground for some of the most heinous serial killers in American history. By the time Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker and Roy Lewis Norris began their rampage in the summer of 1979, the societal foundations of Los Angeles were already under siege. Their spree did not emerge in a vacuum. A quiet but alarming escalation in violent crime had been underway for years. Data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention indicates that Los Angeles's homicide rate surged by over 80% from 1970 to 1979. The city had already been gripped by a pervasive, low-grade terror from concurrent crime waves. The Hillside Strangler, which I will be doing for my next episode, so stay tuned for that. But the Hillside Strangler murders had already caused a public moral panic in 1977 through 1978, leaving young women terrified to go out after dark. Simultaneously, the freeway killer, William Bonin, was active from 1979 to 1980, using a van to abduct his victims and dumping their bodies near freeways. The Golden State Killer also moved his horrifying crime spree into Southern California in 1979. So, there were a lot of crimes going on in the mid-70s, as you can see. The crimes of Bittaker and Norris, therefore, did not introduce a new element of terror. They simply brought it to its most horrifying conclusion. The innocence that was shattered was a fiction, already worn thin by the deeds of their contemporaries. With their unique brand of sadistic, meticulously planned torture, the Toolbox Killers became the personification of the worst fears that had been quietly festering in public consciousness. Their infamy was not a random occurrence, but a direct consequence of a society already primed for a new kind of horror, marking a brutal and final end to a perceived era of naive security. Here, we see a symbiotic union of trauma and violence. The formation of the Toolbox Killers was a catastrophic event built upon decades of psychological damage and systemic failure. Lawrance Bittaker and Roy Norris were not born monsters, but were forged into them through a combination of individual pathology and profoundly troubled upbringings, culminating in a partnership that would prove to be a force for evil. Lawrance Bittaker's life began with a foundation of rejection. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, he was the unwanted child of a couple who had chosen not to have children, and he was placed in an orphanage before being adopted as an infant. His adoptive father's aviation career meant the family moved frequently, denying Bittaker the stable environment he craved. His criminal career began at age 12 with a shoplifting arrest, followed by repeated petty theft. He later rationalized his acts as a way to compensate for his parents' perceived lack of love and consideration. Despite a superior intellect and an IQ of 138, he found school tedious and dropped out at age 17. His criminal behavior escalated rapidly from petty theft to violent recidivism. After being released from the California Youth Authority, he was disowned by his adoptive parents. Over the next 2 decades, he was in and out of prison for a litany of crimes, including car theft, hit and run, and robbery. His psychological profile emerged during this time. In 1961, he was diagnosed as borderline psychotic and basically paranoid, characterized as highly manipulative and possessing considerable concealed hostility. A later psychiatric evaluation in 1966 classified him as a borderline psychopath who was unable to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. A forensic psychologist later determined that Bittaker had faked his previous psychotic behavior, confirming his profound sociopathy. Bittaker himself admitted that his criminal activities gave him a feeling of self-importance. The system's repeated failure to contain this known, high-risk offender, paroling him after serving barely a sixth of a 15-year sentence in one instance, directly enabled his final, deadly crime spree. His manipulative nature allowed him to exploit the legal and penal systems to his advantage, underscoring the system's inherent vulnerability. In contrast to Bittaker's calculated manipulation, Roy Norris's path to depravity was marked by psychological vulnerability rooted in early life trauma. Born to parents who married to avoid social stigma, Norris was an unwanted child who was intermittently in and out of foster care. In these homes, he was reportedly neglected, denied food, and subjected to being essayed, which he later cited as the origin of his prejudice against Hispanic people. The cumulative effect of this childhood trauma is recognized by academic research as a factor that can lead to the development of personality disorders, specifically schizoids, borderline, and antisocial disorders. His profound emotional distress manifested in an attempted suicide at age 16, a chilling precursor to his later actions. After a short, administrative discharge from the Navy for psychological problems, Norris's criminal history became dominated by sexual violence. He amassed a lengthy record of sexual offenses, including raped, attempted raped, and assault with a deadly weapon, for which he was classified as a mentally disordered sex offender. Military psychologists diagnosed him with schizoid personality disorder, a condition characterized by social detachment and emotional blunting. This profile made him an ideal follower for a charismatic, dominating sociopath like Bittaker. The destructive union of Bittaker and Norris began in 1978 at the California Men's Colony at San Luis Obispo. They were described as soulmates, an unsettling designation given the depth of their shared depravity. They bonded over their mutual interest in grape and meticulously analyzed methods of abducting and graping women without getting caught. Once paroled, Bittaker in November 1978 and Norris in January 1979, they immediately put their plans into action. Bittaker purchased a 1977 GMC cargo van with sliding doors, specifically chosen to make it easier to seize victims, which he named the van the Murder Mac. This partnership was a catastrophic synergy between a predatory, sadistic mastermind like Bittaker and a sexually violent, psychologically vulnerable follower like Norris. And without the other, they may have continued their separate cycles of violence, but together, they created a single, far more dangerous entity, culminating in an unprecedented level of torture and murder. Full disclosure, I am not a psychologist. Though I have a degree in psychology, I am not licensed. So therefore, I look to the experts to give a psychological profile comparison on both men. So, Lawrance's detailed upbringing was that he was an unwanted child, adopted, and moved from home to home frequently. And just like Bittaker, Roy Norris was also an unwanted child. Norris had history of neglect and being essayed while in foster care custody. And when it comes to their first arrest, Bittaker was 12 years old when he was first arrested for shoplifting, while Norris was 16 years old when he was arrested for car theft. Bittaker was diagnosed with borderline psychopath, sociopath, manipulative, with a high IQ, while Norris was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder, mentally disordered sex offender. Both men had a role in their sick partnership. With Bittaker high IQ, he was the mastermind, the planner, the ultimate sadist, and the facilitator of violence, while Norris was more of a follower, a physical accomplice, and was psychologically vulnerable. And the crime spree of the Toolbox Killers was not a series of random chaotic acts, but a well-calculated escalating exercise in sadism that reflected their shared depraved fantasies. The name itself, bestowed by the media, came from the chilling reality of their distinctive habits. The majority of the instruments used for torture were common household items from a toolbox, such as pliers, ice picks, and sledgehammers. These two men meticulous planning began months before their first murder. Following their release from prison, they began scouting secluded fire roads in the San Gabriel Mountains, looking for places with adequate privacy. The van, which Bittaker named the Murder Mac, which was a central piece of their strategy, chosen for its sliding doors that would facilitate easy abductions. Their abduction method was consistent. They would drive around Southern California, targeting young teenage girls, often by pretending to be broke down or by offering them rides. Once inside, the victims would be quickly bound and gagged. The chilling intent behind their actions was clear. They were not merely reacting to impulse but were executing a pre-planned, thrill-seeking hunt. These chains of crimes happened over a 5-month period in 1979. The duo kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered 5 teenage girls. The timeline of their crimes shows a grim psychological escalation, moving from a single murder to the abduction of multiple victims at once. Their first victim was a 16-year-old girl named Lucinda Schaffer. This revealed the dynamic of their partnership. After attempting to manually strangle her, Norris became so distraught by the look in her eyes that he ran to the front of the van and vomited. Bittaker, in contrast, was completely unfazed. He then took a wire coat hanger and vice-grip pliers, twisting the wire around Schaffer's neck until she stopped breathing, showcasing his cold, methodical sadism. This moment solidified the roles within their partnership. Norris as the hesitant accomplice and Bittaker as the dominant, sadistic mentor. The spree continued with the murders of Andrea Hall and, in a clear escalation, 2 victims at once, Jackie Gilliam and Jacqueline Lamp. The final murder, that of a 16-year-old girl named Shirley Lynette Ledford, which was the most depraved and documented act. Bittaker turned on his tape recorder to capture her torture, and Norris later confessed that Bittaker made him use a wire hanger and pliers to kill her, which goes to say that Norris hadn't killed anyone yet. This comment reveals that Bittaker was not just a partner in crime, but a facilitator, actively pushing Norris to commit more extreme acts of violence to satisfy his own dark desires. The use of a tape recorder and Polaroids, which were later recovered, further confirms that their crimes were not just about the act itself, but about creating a permanent trophy of their sadistic fantasies. Talk about insane in the membrane. The investigation and trial of Bittaker and Norris stand as a testament to the emotional toll that extreme depravity can take on a justice system. It was a case built not just on forensics, but on the confession of one killer and the raw, unvarnished horror of the evidence he helped to uncover. The arrest of the 2 men was a direct consequence of a plea for leniency. Roy Norris, facing his own criminal charges, confessed his involvement in the 5 murders to a fellow inmate. The information was relayed to the authorities, leading to their swift apprehension. The key to the prosecution's case, however, with Norris's willingness to cooperate, he agreed to a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for his testimony against Bittaker. The deal stipulated that he must provide a complete and truthful account of his and Bittaker's actions. Without the recovery of the victims' bodies, those of Lucinda Schaffer and Andrea Hall were never found. Norris's testimony became the central pillar of the prosecution's case. The trial, led by prosecutor Stephen Kay, was a harrowing experience. The evidence presented was unlike anything most in the courtroom had ever witnessed. It included Polaroids of the victims and the audio tape of Shirley Ledford's torture. The prosecutor's opening words before playing the tape were chilling. "For those of you who don't know what hell is like, you will find out." The 17-minute recording of the 16-year-old screams, filled with the sounds of torture, had a visceral and devastating effect. Many in the courtroom were reduced to tears, while others were compelled to leave. In a profound and horrifying contrast, Bittaker and Norris remained unfazed, even smiling, a chilling manifestation of their absolute psychopathy. The contrasting reactions between a humane, empathetic public and the cold, inhuman indifference of the killers served as a psychological portrait of their depravity. But this is what got me. Remember when I told you that Norris's willingness to cooperate if he was offered a plea to spare him the death penalty, right? Well, even with all the sadistic events they were presented with in court, they still had to hold up their agreement. The legal system's decision to grant a plea deal to a serial killer was a deeply pragmatic one. But if Norris was not fully cooperative and they did not have a testimony, the case against Bittaker might have been jeopardized. This highlights the difficult, and sometimes compromising, nature of justice. The California Supreme Court, in its ruling on Bittaker's appeal, even noted the troubling language in the plea bargain. While legally necessary to secure a conviction for the greater evil, the deal was morally unsettling. The arrangement allowed Norris to avoid the death penalty for his role in 5 murders, and he died of natural causes in prison in 2020, while Bittaker, who was sentenced to death, would live another decade on death row. This outcome forced the public to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that to ensure some form of justice, a terrible compromise had to be made. The aftermath and a lasting psychological toll these 2 men had put on the families of these young girls were devastating, say the least, and the psychological scars on those who confronted their evil and chilling acts. When I was researching into the justice system, it had confirmed that professionals and even jurors who were exposed to graphic evidence of violence and abuse suffered from a form of psychological distress known as vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress. The deaths and psychological trauma of those involved in the case highlighted a critical and often overlooked flaw in the legal system: the lack of adequate mental health support for the very people tasked with confronting and prosecuting extreme depravity. The human cost of justice is a burden that the system has yet to fully acknowledge or address. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case's legacy is the use of the Shirley Ledford audio tape. According to documentaries and media reports, the FBI has used the harrowing recording to train new agents. This is very, very sick. We live in a sick, sadistic world. Their reasonings behind this practice is even worse. They claim that the tape is an unvarnished document of pure sadism that cannot be replicated and serves as a tool to desensitize agents to the extreme violence they may one day encounter. Well, I believe that their decision is a grim experiment. This sort of practice raises ethical questions. I just cannot believe they are using this tragic and traumatic experience that victim had to endure before her death and turn her deadly torture into a gruesome tool for professional development, which forces a new generation to internalize the horror that left its original investigators and prosecutors deeply scarred. This choice encapsulates the uneasy relationship between the pursuit of justice and the cost of human endurance. Goes to show you, we are not cared about at all. But I digress. So here is my final analysis of the Toolbox Killers. Their crimes were the product of a deeply symbiotic relationship between 2 different, yet complementary, pathologies. The fusion of Bittaker's sociopathic mind with Norris's psychologically damaged and impressionable nature created a single, more monstrous entity than either man would have been alone. Bittaker's core motivation was a desire for power and a feeling of self-importance that he derived from his crimes. His high intelligence and manipulative nature allowed him to meticulously plan and orchestrate a complex series of crimes, actively seeking out and exploiting the system's weaknesses. He was the mastermind, the architect of evil who saw no value in human life beyond its capacity to serve his sadistic needs. His complete lack of empathy, a hallmark of his sociopathy, was on chilling display during the trial. And Norris, by contrast, was a broken man with a history of sexual violence that stemmed from his own early trauma. His schizoid personality disorder made him a social recluse with emotional blunting, traits that made him highly susceptible to the influence of a dominant personality. He was not a planner or an innovator of torture, he was an enabler. His initial inability to kill Lucinda Schaffer, and Bittaker's subsequent order for him to commit the final murder demonstrates his role as a follower, a physical accomplice pushed to a new level of sadism by the man he considered his soulmate. The partnership between Bittaker and Norris was a terrifying force multiplier. Bittaker's intellectual sadism could not have been fully realized without a willing physical partner, while Norris's existing proclivities for sexual violence were escalated and organized by a mastermind. They were not two men committing crimes together, but two parts of a single, functional, and deeply depraved system of torture and murder. The crimes of the Toolbox Killers stand as a grim reminder that when broken systems and broken men align, thus resulting damage can be catastrophic and endured for generations.
And so, as we close episode 3, we see that the story of the Toolbox Killers is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within humanity, and the profound, lingering costs that such evil exacts on individuals, communities, and even the system charged with delivering justice. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that sometimes justice demands unsettling compromises, and that those charged with seeing justice done may themselves become victims of trauma. As we reflect on this case, we are compelled to consider the importance of compassion, the need for mental health support within the justice system, and the obligation to honor the memory of the victims by working to prevent such horrors in the future. The legacy of this case is not only found in its details, but in the ongoing challenge to preserve our humanity while facing its darkest corners. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we explore more crime stories across the globe. Thank you for listening.